Welcome back, everybody. There's been a ton of rumors lately about is Xbox going to buy Sega or Square Enix or Konami? Basically, everyone at one point or another has been a part of some rumor about an Xbox acquisition, and with E3 coming up in about a month, that's not going to be slowing down anytime soon. So I thought I'd go and break down the what ifs for Xbox acquiring every major publisher so that if any of these rumors come up again or actually happen, then you can come back to this video and figure out exactly what it means. This took a lot of research time, so I really hope you like it. But anyway, let's get into it. I should mention there are actually a couple of publishers that I'm not really going to talk about, like 505 Games and Devolver Digital, because neither of them really make games of their own. So far as I can tell, they're just strictly publishers, and Xbox doesn't really need another publishing branch, especially a smaller one like that only has experience with like smaller indie games, so it just doesn't make any kind of sense for them to even be looking into acquiring either of those two publishers. And also, for what I hope are obvious reasons, I won't be talking about either Nintendo or PlayStation being acquired by Xbox, because I'm not Alex Jones. You know, we're going to be talking about things that might potentially actually happen, even though they are, I think, fairly unlikely. You know, an acquisition of Nintendo or PlayStation, that's just not on the table. I mean, if it did happen, you can guarantee that there will be a video on this channel about it, but it's not gonna happen. So first up is Sega, and they're a really big deal. You know, this is the team, the publisher, that back when they were a platform holder, they used to go toe-to-toe, debatably, with Nintendo. And while their name may not mean as much now or hold the same amount of weight as it used to back then, they're still a really big deal. And I believe that on this list that we're about to go through, they are the most likely to be acquired by Xbox for a number of reasons that we'll go into. The first of which is just that, much like Bethesda, who we've already seen be acquired by Xbox, they have a history of association with Xbox. You know, when Xbox was originally getting into the games industry, they came very close to acquiring Sega as well as a handful of others. You know, all the way back to the original Xbox, there has been a history of exclusive games for Xbox from Sega, things like Jet Set Radio and Otogi. Creative Assembly, one of Sega's studios, has made both of the Halo Wars games. So they've handled Xbox's flagship franchise. And right now, Relic is working alongside Xbox's World's Edge to make Age of Empires 4. So there's clearly some kind of ongoing partnership between Sega and Xbox. And it goes even a little bit further than that. Because, like we've seen at the launch of the Series X and S, Xbox had the exclusive access to the next-gen version of Yakuza 7, which is a big deal because, as far as I'm aware, I think that's the first time that a Yakuza game has launched on an Xbox platform at all. Like, I mean, they had ones put into Game Pass, I think, before that, but, you know, it was the first time that one launched into an Xbox. We've seen multiple, like the entire Yakuza franchise, go into Game Pass as well as a handful of other Sega games, and we've seen Sega come out and talk about how great that's been for them, talk about what a boon it's been, how much more visibility in the West they've gotten through Game Pass. And it was Xbox who was able to finally, after so many years, bring Phantasy Star Online 2 over to the West. So there is very clearly some kind of vested interest between Xbox and Sega, and it's hard to tell. You know, it might be slightly more one-sided with Xbox, you know, having more of an interest in Sega than Sega has in Xbox, but it's still very much there. And so let's just run through everything that Sega has so that we can get an understanding of exactly the amount of weight that Sega holds in the modern day. So they have a number of studios that I feel are worth mentioning. You've got Ryuga Gotoku Studio, who are the guys who make the Yakuza games, and Judgment, which is basically just Yakuza. If you didn't know, it's really good. There's Sonic Team, who obviously makes Sonic. There's Creative Assembly, who we talked about a little bit earlier. They make the Halo Wars games, but they've also made Alien Isolation and the entire Total War franchise, which is one of my favorite franchises to ever exist. You've got Sports Interactive, who does things like Football Manager. You've got 2 Point Studios, which is a very small studio, but they did 2 Point Hospital, which has been very popular lately. You've got Amplitude, who's done Endless Space and Humankind, and Atlas, who's done, really big things with Persona and Shin Megami Tensei, be it Nocturne, Digital Devil Saga, Devil Summoner. They did Catherine, Odin Sphere, like just a huge library of JRPGs coming out of Atlas, and they have multiple divisions, so they're a huge deal just by themselves. And then finally, there's Relic Entertainment, who has done Company of Heroes, Warhammer Space Marine, and is currently working on Age of Empires 4, which I said before. And a handful of other franchises that they own, IPs that Xbox would get in that deal, include Crazy Taxi, Daytona USA, Golden Axe, Jet Set Radio, Panzer Dragoon, Phantasy Star, Shenmue, Streets of Rage, Monkey Ball, Valkyria Chronicles, and Virtua Fighter. So, Xbox acquiring Sega would be a huge deal. And Sega is exactly the kind of acquisition that Xbox is looking to make. We've heard a couple of different things that Xbox and Phil Spencer specifically are looking for, and I'm using those sort of as a criteria. You're going to hear me talk about these 3 points quite a bit going forward, throughout this list. But those 3 things are, does it affect the Japanese market? Like, is it good for Japan? Does it bring with it more E-rated, like, children's games? And does it have legacy? And Sega has all 3 of those things like crazy, right? Obviously, Sega is huge in Japan. There are Sega arcades all over the place. Sega is a household name here, but even more so in Japan. So them becoming part of Xbox would very easily get them that foothold that they've been trying to get in Japan forever. As far as like children's games, E-rated games, there's Sonic. You don't really need more than that. Outside of Nintendo, Sonic is probably the most noteworthy children's video game mascot of all time. So that's covered. And then Legacy, that's again covered very solidly by things like Sonic and Persona and Yakuza, Total War. There's such a storied history of Sega games that it just carries a ton of weight, Sega. And I know I've probably said that multiple times, but it's because it's true. Sega is a big deal in the games industry, even now. And on top of that, we've seen Sega sort of make moves that make me think that they're looking to be acquired. In recent history, on top of trying to, get into the West more with things like Game Pass, they've also separated their games division from the rest of the company, the Sammy division that does things like pachinko machines and gambling and all that kind of stuff. Meaning that games division could very easily, for the right price, be sold off and leave Sega Sammy alone to do its own thing. So Sega, I think, would be the most ideal purchase and also the most likely purchase on this list. Next up, and I have a lot less to say about this one, is Capcom. It would have been a lot more likely for Xbox to acquire Capcom around 2014, when they were sort of going through dire straits and they were financially in trouble. But the last couple years, Capcom's just been absolutely killing it with things like Resident Evil 2 and 3 Remake, with Monster Hunter World and Rise. They're just doing extremely well right now, which means that they are worth more and therefore less likely to be acquired. It doesn't make it impossible. Xbox has a ton of money, but just dramatically less likely. We have, however, seen in the past a partnership between Capcom and Xbox. During the 360 era, Dead Rising was one of the biggest reasons to own a 360. It was one of the biggest, outside of Halo and Gears, obviously, one of the biggest exclusive franchises for that platform. And that is, of course, a Capcom product. More recently, we've seen marketing deals with things like Devil May Cry 5, but not a ton. Let's just go over exactly what Capcom owns to figure out exactly how worth it this purchase would be. They, of course, own Resident Evil, Monster Hunter, Street Fighter, Mega Man, Devil May Cry, Dead Rising, which we talked about, Marvel vs. Capcom, Onimusha, Ace Attorney, and a bunch of other franchises and IPs that I thought were just not very much worth mentioning, but they have a lot more than that. And again, this does fit all three of the criteria that I believe Xbox is looking for a big acquisition. Obviously this meets the Japanese criteria. Like, it is a Japanese publisher. These games are all very big in Japan, especially things like Monster Hunter, Street Fighter, Devil May Cry. Basically everything they make except maybe Dead Rising is really, really big in Japan. Kids games, we've got Mega Man coming out of them, and arguably Monster Hunter. I don't know if that necessarily qualifies as like a kids game because it is pretty violent. But it does have that sort of fun kids vibe. So I'm going to count that. And obviously just all sorts of legacy. You're getting Resident Evil, which would be a big deal for Xbox in particular, because with their Bethesda purchase, they got Shinji Mikami, who created Resident Evil, so that would be a big deal for them. And then, basically every franchise that I listed earlier has a major legacy to it. Monster Hunter, obviously Street Fighter, Mega Man is, it just, everything that I listed earlier has a massive legacy. And alongside getting Capcom, you would also get some pretty impressive technology, like the RE engine, which they used for the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes. That engine is probably one of the most impressive ones in the industry right now, and it would be a really great thing for Xbox to own going forward. They could apply that to many of their games across the board, and they would all almost certainly start to look better. You know what I mean? So that's a really big deal. So this is definitely a purchase that I think they maybe are looking into. It just feels less likely because the relationship between the two is not as powerful as it is with Sega. It's not as tight or as recent. There's definitely something going on between them as far as like building a relationship, but I don't think that's necessarily leading to an acquisition. I think it's far more likely that we see things like marketing deals, like Xbox might get more marketing deals for their next Resident Evil game or what have you. I think we'll probably see Capcom games going into Game Pass, not necessarily at launch, but maybe shortly after launch. Maybe even get some exclusive partnership deals with them, like make a new Dead Rising game, although 4 was pretty bad, so maybe we don't want that. But I think there's something going on there. I just don't think it's an acquisition. Third up is Square Enix. This is the most recent rumor to come through. The rumor is saying that there's multiple interested parties looking to purchase Sega, and Microsoft is, of course, one of the names being thrown around with that because they've been doing a lot of acquiring lately, and they have a ton of money, So, especially since that Discord deal didn't go through, they theoretically have the $10 billion that they were looking to spend there burning a hole in their pocket, looking to be spent somewhere else. So anything is possible, but Square Enix, a couple of their people have come out and said that they are not looking to be purchased, which seems like a pretty clear sign that they aren't, because I don't know why they would say that if they were, unless like they're trying to hold out for the money to get be worth more money, or for deals to come in a little bit more aggressively, or maybe the deal's already been done, they've already decided where they're going, and so like they're not for sale, they're sold. But those both seem pretty unlikely, so I really don't think Square is going to get bought. anytime soon, theoretically. But let's jump into the what if machine and look at what it could mean. Microsoft actually, much like with Sega, did attempt to purchase Square whenever they first entered the industry, and they were actually really close to doing so. Like, it was a very last minute thing that it fell apart. And Square Enix has a lot of weight behind their studios. They've got Crystal Dynamics, who does Tomb Raider, the newer ones, the reboots, and the newest, the Avengers game. There's Eidos Montreal, who does Deus Ex, and then they have a couple of different internal studios that are just called creative business units, and there's 4 of those. They're not very interestingly named, but, one of them does the Final Fantasy games and the Kingdom Hearts games. Another one does Dragon Quest and Nier and Bravely Default and Octopath. You've got an MMO division that does, obviously, the 2 Final Fantasy games. They did 11 and 14, but they've also done, like, Dragon Quest Builders, and they're working on Final Fantasy 16. And then the last one works on the Legend of Mana series and does a lot of, like, remake and port work. They own a lot of franchises. Like, on top of all the ones that I just listed, they've also got Just Cause, Life is Strange, Legacy of Kain, Parasite Eve, Star Ocean, bunch of others, so Thunder. So they have a lot. It's storming here. They have a lot of weight behind them. And again, it fits the criteria of what Microsoft is looking for. Again, obviously Square Enix is really big in Japan. Final Fantasy is huge. Dragon Quest is one of the biggest franchises in Japan of all time ever. So that box is checked 4 times over. Obviously a huge deal in Japan. Kids games, again, Dragon Quest is a really good kids game. If it was marketed more in the West, probably a lot of us would have played it as kids. There's Kingdom Hearts, obviously. That is one that struck it really big in the West, and it's just a really popular kids game. And then, obviously, Legacy, again, Final Fantasy. You know what I mean? Like, it's one of the longest running and most successful game franchises of all time. So it checks all 3 of those boxes very well. So I can definitely understand why somebody like Xbox would be interested in buying Square Enix. On top of all of the games and the production value, there's also some really impressive tech. They have multiple engines, including Crystal Tools and the Luminous engine that they used for the most recent Final Fantasy games and a couple other things that are both fairly impressive. They're very good engines to be used. And Square might actually be a little bit interested in getting into a partnership with Xbox, because they have tried in the past multiple times to get into cloud gaming and have just failed again and again. So with xCloud becoming a thing and by all accounts working very well, I could see Square Enix being interested in becoming a part of at least that ecosystem as far as that is concerned. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a partnership of some kind come through, like hopefully finally get Final Fantasy 14 over onto Xbox platforms, and then you could play it mobile through xCloud. That would be great. That'd be a really big deal for Xbox players and for that franchise in general. But as far as an acquisition goes, it still doesn't feel particularly likely. My gut instinct is to say that it's more likely to see Square be acquired by Sony. They've had a more palpable partnership, especially recently. You see things like Final Fantasy VII being a timed exclusive for PlayStation, or Final Fantasy 16 is going to be a timed exclusive, or like Final Fantasy 14 has been only on PC and PlayStation for years, and as far as I'm aware, we still don't know when it's coming over to Xbox, although they keep being really cagey about it. So it probably will at some point, but we just don't know when. So that makes me think that PlayStation is probably more likely to make that acquisition. But then at the same time, you look at the Bethesda acquisition, and it's like Ghostwire Tokyo and Deathloop here. Those are both timed PlayStation exclusives coming from studios that Xbox now owns. So literally anything is possible, but it doesn't seem likely as far as I'm concerned. So next up is EA. And again, I don't think this one is particularly likely for just a multitude of reasons, not the least of which is that other than the criteria that I've been using up to this point, another thing that Xbox has been saying that they look for in the studios and the teams that they acquire is a strong and trustworthy leadership structure. And while EA makes some really impressive games and makes a ton of money, I wouldn't call their leadership team trustworthy. You know, one of the last things that Xbox needs at this point in their lifespan is more bad press. And EA seems to find themselves in bad press consistently. So I think it would be very risky and maybe not a great idea for Xbox to even look into acquiring EA. But there are a lot of positives to a potential EA acquisition, so we'll go through all of those. First of all, EA has an incredible amount of development power. They have 46 development teams. Now, most of those aren't really worth mentioning. They're very small teams or they're support teams, but still an incredible amount of just development potential. Some of their more noteworthy teams are BioWare, which is probably number one in my heart as far as this list is concerned. They, of course, make Mass Effect, Dragon Age, Star Wars The Old Republic, Jade Empire, just some of my favorite games of all times, even though they have sort of slipped in recent years. Hopefully they can get back to what they once were. You got Codemasters doing Dirt 4, Grid, F1, and Criterion Games doing Burnout and Need for Speed. So a lot of racing games, which I don't necessarily think Xbox needs because they already kind of had that genre locked down with Forza as far as I'm concerned. But regardless, you've also got DICE, who does Battlefield and Battlefront, which are both extremely popular, although Battlefront has had quite a bit of a tumultuous past. You've got Maxis, who does the Sims games, again, extremely popular. You got PopCap doing Bejeweled, Plants vs. Zombies, and Peggle. You've got Respawn coming out with Titanfall, Apex Legends, and Jedi Fallen Order. And, as I said before, tons of other teams either supporting those studios or making very small other projects of their own. So there's a huge development potential coming out of EA. You know, they also own a bunch of other very popular franchises like Crysis, Command & Conquer, Dead Space, and Mirror's Edge that don't really, as far as I could tell, get assigned to a particular studio that still exists. So, again, there's a lot of reasons to want to acquire EA, but it doesn't meet the criteria that I've been using up to this point for a team that Xbox specifically would be looking for. You know, as far as the Japanese audience goes, EA basically doesn't exist. Like, almost none of these games take off in Japan. They're just not very popular over there. They've never been successful in that market. So there's really nothing for that. As far as kid games go, again, not really a lot. Like, you've got The Sims, but that's maybe for like a teen audience. Like, it's not exactly kids, like a kid's game. Like, I feel like they would get bored of that very quickly. And then Legacy, that one, they absolutely check. You know, you've got all the sports titles. You've got all the BioWare titles. You've got things like Need for Speed and Battlefield and Battlefront and The Sims. You know, Legacy is checked well and truly. But the other two criteria, it just doesn't quite meet as far as I'm concerned. It does, however, an EA purchase would potentially come with some really impressive tech. You know, you get the Frostbite engine, the Ego engine, the Ignite engine. You get the Origin storefront, which would be good for Microsoft, because even though the Origin storefront is not necessarily the most impressive PC storefront, I think most people would agree that it's probably better than what Microsoft has going at the moment. Although apparently they're looking to revamp it anyway, so who knows what that's going to end up looking like. You know, so there are a lot of positives. You know, there's big franchises that you could get out of this. There's some really impressive tech, but, you know, with EA just constantly being in bad press and, you know, making bad leadership plays, I just think Xbox is better off keeping what they already have. You know, that deal to have EA Play in Game Pass, I feel like that already gives Xbox all of the positives that they would get from acquiring EA, or at least most of them, without having to face the backlash whenever like the next FIFA game has ridiculous microtransactions, or like Battlefront 3 that comes out and is, back on the chopping block for having extremely predatory loot boxes, Me personally, I wish that they would just rescue BioWare out of EA, but that's almost certainly not going to happen, and I just don't see this acquisition being done by anybody anytime soon. Next up, in very much the same vein as EA, is Ubisoft, and this one I'm a little bit of a toss-up on, because, I don't think there's necessarily a huge reason to acquire Ubisoft for Xbox, and I don't think it meets a lot of the criteria that they're looking for. But I could see it happening in like a defensive way. We'll get into that in a little bit, but first of all, let's just recap what Ubisoft is capable of. They have some monumental franchises under their belt. They have obviously Assassin's Creed, but also Watch Dogs, Far Cry, Rayman, Just Dance, all the Tom Clancy games, be it The Division, Rainbow Six, Splinter Cell, Ghost Recon. They have some really impressive tech, be it Anvil Next or the Snowdrop engine, and it would be an extra good bonus for Microsoft to be able to take the Uplay library and just fold that directly into Game Pass like they've done with EA Play. Ubisoft has 50 development teams. I'm not going to go through all of them because the overwhelming majority of them are just called like Ubisoft and then a location. So it would be very redundant to go through all of them, especially since most of them work on all of the big projects. Like it's not just like Ubisoft Bangladesh works on the Assassin's Creed games. Like it's not like that. A lot of the studios work on a lot of games, so it's very hard to break down exactly who does what. Regardless, though, 50 development teams, but only one is in Japan, that being Ubisoft Osaka, and they only really do handheld games like Pets, as far as I can tell. So I'm not sure if that really meets our criteria for appealing to the Japanese market. As far as kids games go, they've got that. You've got Rayman, which hasn't really put out a game recently, as far as I can remember, but could very easily be brought back, as well as Just Dance, which, has always been really popular and has been coming out quietly but consistently for as long as I can remember. And then Legacy, as far as that's concerned, they got that locked down. Assassin's Creed is one of the biggest franchises in the West. We've also got, the entire Legacy Tom Clancy library. So there's a lot going on there. And, just having 50 development studios is a huge get. But I feel like, weirdly, that's a lot of teams to acquire and then have to pay and do like insurance and all that stuff for the amount that you're getting. Like, it seems like Ubisoft has way more teams than they need for the amount of games that they put out, if that makes sense, which makes them seem like an overly expensive purchase. That being said, though, I do think that it's extremely likely that we see a partnership with them like what Xbox has with EA. I think it's extremely likely that at some point the Uplay library gets folded into Game Pass. It just makes sense. Uplay by itself doesn't do numbers. It doesn't do very well. So then being able to get onto Game Pass and see that boost in sales and then get guaranteed money, obviously coming from Xbox, it just makes a lot of sense for everyone involved. But I don't see Xbox fully acquiring Ubisoft, especially since recently-ish, they actually fought off an acquisition by Vivendi. So it seems very likely that Ubisoft isn't looking to be purchased by anybody. But if another hostile takeover like that started coming in from a less trustworthy publisher, let's say, like if Vivendi came back, or, a different part of Tencent, or like the Embracer Group, or, one of these sort of ambiguous unknowns started trying to buy Ubisoft, and potentially not release those games on an Xbox platform, like say if PlayStation was going to acquire Ubisoft, I could see in that case Xbox moving in and making the attempt to acquire Ubisoft themselves just to keep those games coming to their platform. But that's really the only situation in which I could see that happening. So next up is Activision Blizzard, and they haven't really been making any signs that they either are looking to sell or that they necessarily need to sell for like financial reasons. But weirdly, I feel like given certain criteria at the time of their purchase, a hypothetical purchase, they could make a really great fit for the Xbox family. And I know that probably sounds weird, but give me a chance to explain it, and hopefully it'll make more sense by the end. The first thing that we have to look at, though, is just the weight that Activision Blizzard carries, because it's massive. First of all, there's obviously Blizzard, who they make some of the most popular games of all time. You've got World of Warcraft, you've got StarCraft, Overwatch, Diablo, and every single one of those games is sort of the de facto game in each of those genres. Like World of Warcraft is the MMO, Overwatch is the hero shooter, and that sort of goes for a lot of the games that Blizzard makes, because when they settle in to make a game, they make sure that they are on the top of the pile. On the Activision side of things, there are 8 other studios, including Infinity Ward, Sledgehammer, and Treyarch, who make the Call of Duty franchise. Again, an absolutely massive franchise. You've got High Moon Studio, which just kind of helps with Call of Duty, but also worked on Destiny 1 and 2 alongside Bungie. You've got Toys for Bob, who worked on the Crash Insane trilogy, Spyro Reignited, and more recently Crash 4. You've got a handful of others like Beenox, Demonware, and Ravensoft, who seem to mostly do smaller things and support work, but they are also there. And then they own a handful of other really noteworthy franchises, I'll say, like Geometry Wars, Guitar Hero, Cabela's, King's Quest, Lost Vikings, and Space Quest, which you might not have heard of Space Quest because it's really old and hasn't been relevant for like 30 years. I personally really like those games, which is why I chose to mention them. But there's some other big gets on top of, obviously, the weight of the games are a huge esports scene. StarCraft, Overwatch, those are huge esport games, but also Activision Blizzard apparently owns the MLG brand, the Major League Gaming brand. So that would be a huge get. And then they also own King, who makes Candy Crush, which is just one of the biggest money-making things in the games industry presently, or maybe ever. It's a big deal. And Activision Blizzard does kind of meet all of the criteria that I've set forward for a potential acquisition for Xbox. They're not in Japan, like none of their studios are there, but a lot of the games that they make are extremely popular there. Things like StarCraft and Overwatch are huge in the Asian markets. You've got kids covered with Crash Bandicoot and Spyro, like, check. Legacy is obvious with, basically everything, but, StarCraft, Warcraft, Crash, Spyro, Call of Duty, Diablo, Tony Hawk, like, covered. Legacy is covered. The only negative is that they have been known to have recently a pretty bad leadership structure. But unlike EA, where it's just kind of EA in general that people have a bad feeling towards, if Xbox were to acquire Activision Blizzard, there's really just one guy who would have to probably be removed, and that guy is Bobby Kotick, who is consistently in the news as far as video games are concerned for doing just some pretty scummy things, some very money grubbing things. But I feel like if you were to, as a condition of the acquisition, remove him from the company and replace him with somebody more trustworthy, then that perception sort of goes away. And when you look at the games that they put out, they don't have that same level of like predatory microtransactions that a lot of EA games have. So really, this negative perception towards Activision Blizzard is pretty succinctly focused on this one man who could be very easily paid to retire. You know what I mean? And it would just be an absolutely massive get for Xbox to be able to have all of these franchises, to have Call of Duty and World of Warcraft added to their fold. I don't think that either of those would become exclusive games, but they wouldn't really have to. Just being able to collect the money from those alone would be monumental. That being said, while I think this would be a huge acquisition and is far from impossible, I also just don't see it happening. It seems like this would be an extremely expensive acquisition, and yes, you would be getting a ton from it, but I don't think you're at risk of anybody else acquiring Activision Blizzard, so you're not at risk of like losing them from your platform. I could see it being more likely that they try to go and, since they're adding mouse and keyboard support to the, Series X and the newer consoles, I could see them trying to do partnerships where it's like, can we get World of Warcraft playing on an Xbox? Can we get StarCraft or Warcraft or Diablo? I mean, Diablo already does. Can we get StarCraft playing on an Xbox? I could see that happening, and I don't think an acquisition is off the table. I just don't see it happening anytime soon. All right, next up, Bandai Namco. This one's going to be pretty fast because I don't think there's any reason for Xbox to look into acquiring them, because there's just not a whole lot that you would get out of it. They own some relevant franchises. You've got Pac-Man, Ace Combat, Katamari, Klonoa, Tales, Tekken, Soul Calibur. They own the Dark Souls trademark, which I didn't know until I did research for this video. And they do a lot of anime games like Naruto, Dragon Ball, and One Piece, which they don't actually own those trademarks. They just happen to be the ones who do a lot of them. And while this does fit all of my criteria, it is clearly Japanese. It is a Japanese company. You would get pull in Japan with things like Tekken and Katamari if you were to bring that back. You've got kids covered, again, with Katamari and all the anime titles. And there is legacy there with Tekken, with Ace Combat, with Pac-Man. But it's just so much less than everybody else on this list. It doesn't feel like they're super worth the acquisition. And that might sound really harsh, but if I'm Xbox, if I'm Microsoft, looking at this list as, I'm going to acquire one or two of these, Bandai Namco is very low on my priority list as far as I'm concerned. I just absolutely don't think Xbox should buy Bandai Namco. If they did, it would be good for them. Like, there is no bad group to buy on this list except maybe EA, but it's just dramatically less good than the others. Next up is Take-Two, and while I do think that this would be an absolutely massive acquisition and it would probably shake up the industry in a way that I don't think people are at all prepared for, I also don't think, weirdly, that it's worth it for Xbox or really for anybody to look into acquiring Take-Two. Let me explain. Take-Two has three different publishing groups, those being 2K, Private Division, and Rockstar. And then they have studios like Visual Concept that do the 2K sports games, NBA, NHL, WWE. They've got Firaxis that does Civilization and the XCOM series. And Rockstar has 10 different studios, and they make Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead Redemption. And then they own franchises like Bioshock, Bully, and L.A. Noire. So there's some really big things that you would get from an acquisition of Take-Two, but I just don't think it's enough, if that makes sense. 2K Sports makes a lot of money, but it also has some really terrible press. Those NBA games get absolutely destroyed every single time they come out because of extremely predatory practices with their loot boxes. Rockstar is great. They make some amazingly popular games that make a ton of money, but the fact of the matter is, if you were to acquire them, you are paying 10 different studios that only are able to put out one game a generation historically, which would be good in terms of getting your money back. Like Grand Theft Auto makes its money back. Rockstar is a money-making studio, despite the fact that they put out games so infrequently, but it just doesn't really work for the way Xbox is running their business. Like, if you put out one game a generation, you're not going to turn around the Xbox has no games narrative. You're just not going to do anything about that, you know? And it just doesn't seem worth it as far as that's concerned. And then they don't meet any of the criteria that I put forward. They are not popular in Japan. You know, sports games are not popular over there. Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead don't really do anything over there. There's nothing for kids. Even like at a stretch, you could say that NBA is kind of for kids, but then you have to deal with the predatory loot boxes, and it's like, is that worth it? Really? I don't think so. It does have legacy. You know, Grand Theft Auto has that legacy. You get that legacy from the 2K Sports titles, from Civilization and all that. So you've got legacy, but just the other two are so nothing that, again, I just don't feel like it's worth it for Xbox to make this acquisition, because Take-Two is going to be extremely expensive. They make a ton of money from these sports games from Rockstar, from Grand Theft Auto, from Red Dead Redemption, but they don't put out games frequently enough other than the sports titles. It just doesn't make sense to me monetarily for Xbox or for anybody else to try and move in and buy up Take-Two. So I absolutely don't see this happening for anybody. I just feel like there are better options for publishers to acquire across the board. Next up is one that I think actually has a pretty decent chance of happening, that being Konami. Now, with Konami, you're not getting a whole lot in terms of development power. You know, they don't really make games anymore, and genuinely, I tried to research it. I'm not even sure how many studios or development teams they have. Presumably at least one, but I couldn't find it. That being said, if you're just buying the IP from Konami and letting them continue to do all their weird pachinko gambling stuff by themselves, this could be a very cheap acquisition in comparison to everything else on this list, which makes it very appealing, because you're getting some extremely storied IP. You're getting things like Silent Hill, Metal Gear, Zone of the Enders, Castlevania, Contra, Silent Scope, and on. Like, absolutely amazing franchises. Even if you're not getting teams that make those games, you're still meeting two of the three criteria that I put out. You're hitting that Japanese audience really hard with Metal Gear, Zone of the Enders, Castlevania, and then legacy with just everything. Every single one of those is a storied franchise that people cares about, you know? And you could very easily give those IP to the studios that Xbox already has and get quality products out of them. If you gave Silent Hill to Tango Gameworks, they would make an amazing Silent Hill game. If you gave Castlevania to Ninja Theory, they would do an awesome job. Same thing with Metal Gear 2 Machine Games. Or if all the rumors about Microsoft making long-term deals with Kojima is correct, you could just buy the IP and give all of them to him, and then you would get games basically as they were in their heyday during the PS2 era. People would absolutely eat that up. And, you know, we know that Konami's been shopping around the idea of either selling off their IP or licensing it out to other people for a while now, specifically with Silent Hill. So this feels like something that will happen sooner or later. Whether or not it's Xbox that buys it, I strongly feel that somebody in the next few years will purchase the Konami IP. And I'm excited for that because I would really like to see some of those IPs actually get good games again, because it's been a minute. Second to last is Koei Tecmo, and I mostly put this on the list for fun because I don't actually think that it would necessarily be anybody's first choice, much like Bandai Namco, but I do think that it is more likely than that one. And the reason for that is that I feel like they have more relevant franchises currently. You know, you've got the Dynasty Warriors and all the Warriors games, you've got Atelier, you've got Dead or Alive, Ninja Gaiden, Fatal Frame, and Neo. And on top of that, it meets all three of my criteria, right? It hits the Japanese audience with like Ninja Gaiden and Dead or Alive. It's also a Japanese publisher, which means that, you know, it's something that they value more, generally speaking. You have kids games sort of with the Warriors games, depending on which franchise you plug in there, could be very big for children audiences. And then Legacy, you've got that with Ninja Gaiden, with Fatal Frame, with Dead or Alive. So it hits all three of my criteria, maybe not as hard as others, but it does hit them. And on top of that, they do have a history of doing exclusives in the past with Xbox with Ninja Gaiden. So I could see Xbox wanting to get Ninja Gaiden back into their library in an exclusive capacity. That being said, they do more recently have exclusive history with both of the other platform holders, be it with Nintendo doing things like Fire Emblem Heroes or Hyrule Warriors, or with PlayStation doing Neo. This one could be purchased by genuinely anyone. So I don't necessarily think that Microsoft is even at the top of that list, but they are actively looking and have all the money, so it could happen. Last up is one that I think has a very small chance of having already been purchased by Microsoft, and that is Warner Brothers. Now, this does get a little bit into conspiracy theory territory, so take it with a massive grain of salt, and it's probably not true. But we know that Microsoft was very interested in acquiring them recently and was in talks for a long time before the deal just kind of mysteriously stopped. And we never heard what the reason for that was. We never heard that they stopped wanting to sell or that somebody else had stepped in and made a better offer, which to me says that there is a small chance that they're just trying to keep it a secret and that Microsoft is already in the processes of finalizing that deal. Now, it could also just be, and it's more likely, that the deal just dried up and that they haven't been acquired. But let me dream for a second. Here's the reason that I think Microsoft is extremely, or should be extremely, interested in WB games. They have some absolutely excellent studios behind them. You got Avalanche Software, who is currently working on Hogwarts Legacy, and before that they've done a lot of licensed Disney stuff. You got Monolith Productions, who did Shadow of War, That series, Condemned and Fear. You've got NetherRealm Studios, who does Mortal Kombat and Injustice. You've got Rocksteady Studio, who does Batman Arkham and is currently working on the Suicide Squad game. Traveler's Tales, that does all the Lego games. And WB Montreal, who did Arkham Origins and is currently working on Gotham Knights. So this meets two of my three requirements. It's not Japanese. It's not a Japanese publisher. They don't have any games that particularly scream Japanese audience to me. So it's a miss on that front completely. But they've got kids covered very well with all the Lego games, plus just Batman. You know, kids love Batman. And then you've got legacy for sure with Mortal Kombat, with the Arkham games, with some of the IP that comes with this purchase. And it just feels like these studios would be a very good fit for the Xbox family. You know, there's a lot of good leadership behind these teams with people like Ed Boon, and that's another thing that Xbox has historically been looking for in the people that they are acquiring. So this seems to me to be right up at the top couple options for who I think Xbox is looking into acquiring and could potentially acquire in the future. If they haven't already. They didn't, but they could have. So that's that. Every major publisher I thought was relevant to this conversation broken down into what it would mean if Xbox were to acquire them and how likely I think that is to happen. You could probably apply a lot of what I said to if PlayStation or somebody else were looking to want to acquire one of these publishers. It's just that Xbox seems to be the one in all of the rumors, so that seemed like the place to focus. But anyway, this video took a ton of time and energy to make, so it would really mean a lot to me if you would give this video a like, share it with a friend, or subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I'm trying to hit 100 subscribers by my birthday, and I literally cannot do that without you. So please, if you like my content, do subscribe. And anyway, until next time, I'll see you around.